Graduated from high school in '63, went to the University of Washington and graduated in '67. I was in Navy ROTC, so upon graduation I was commissioned as an ensign in the Navy. And I went right to flight school in Pensacola, Florida. Flight training was a year and a half. So I completed flight training in 1968, 69 area. And then I ended up flying P-3s, which is a 4-engine turboprop anti-submarine warfare aircraft. And I flew that for basically 3 years until the middle of 1972, which included a year in Vietnam in Cam Ranh Bay. And we deployed between Sangley Point, Philippines, and Cam Ranh Bay, in and out, and we flew missions in Vietnam.
Okay. However, I must report with regret that no progress has taken place on the negotiating front. The enemy still demands that we unilaterally and unconditionally withdraw all American forces, that in the process we overthrow the elected government of South Vietnam, and that the United States accept a political state settlement that would have the practical consequence of the forcible imposition of a communist government upon the people of South Vietnam. That would mean humiliation and defeat for the United States. This we cannot and will not accept.
It's, boy, you can talk about that one all day. What about the war in general, killing 50-some thousand men? Was it worthwhile? You know, the purported purpose was to give the South Vietnamese people the right of self-determination. That was the phraseology. And sometimes 20/20 hindsight, you know, gives you a different perspective, and it's hard to answer that question. Probably the war was unnecessary on balance. The French fell at Dien Bien Phu, and there was this concept of the domino theory, that if Vietnam, which was called French Indochina then because it was a colony of France, if it were to fall, then Laos and Cambodia and blah, 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 blah. That was all political philosophy and theory back then. Probably not true. So whatever was done to shorten the war was probably just fine. So I guess I'll agree.
This is the Kremlin, citadel of Russian communism. Looking at Russia, we might see it as a country to be studied, as we study other nations of the world. Yet we know that Russia today is regarded as a grave threat to our nation, to our freedom, to the peace of the world. Why so? What makes it a threat? Looking closer, we see a clue. Public display of giant portraits of communist leaders. These leaders, by their actions, have caused the world to stand guard. Here, in Russia, you see the reason why so many nations are building up their defenses. Here, in Russia, you see the reason why we are spending billions of dollars in defense production. Why your family is paying the highest taxes in our history. The leaders of Russia tell us their only concern is the defense of their own nation. Is this so? Or are they ambitious for world conquest? Question. A question of communism.
Yeah, communism is a political philosophy. It's a governmental political philosophy that doesn't provide freedom. And it's very repressive, and it's just the antithesis of capitalism. And as a form of government, I think it's repulsive, because it totally constricts freedom, and that's what we're all about in this country. So, it's not like a disease you'll die from, but it's a political philosophy that is very uncomfortable for anybody that enjoys freedom. P3 is a It's the old Lockheed Electra constant speed axial flow single spool gas turbine engines, if anybody cares.
When you work your way through the valleys and over the ridges in daylight or in the dark of night.
Well, you know, I mean, I had a Navy scholarship to the University of Washington, so I knew I was going to be in the Navy when I graduated in some capacity. And once you're in the military, you have an obligation to fulfill what the military asks you to do during the period you're in there. So it wasn't like I had a choice, it was just honoring my obligation, my military obligation, which I didn't hesitate to do for a second. I understood that.
Money was 90 cents a day, 5 days a week, $4.50 a week. That's what you got for going on to advanced ROTC. Okay, let's see. All right. Okay. So that's the way I went through college.
War continued to drag on. Some in the movement became frustrated, not realizing the effect they were having in the halls of power.
Throughout the war, the anti-war movement was haunted with the fear that it was just not having much effect, that no one in Washington was listening. In fact, both the Johnson and Nixon administrations listened very carefully and had great fear of the anti-war movement.
Yeah, you know, it was true that it was a tumultuous period of time from the late 60s to the early 70s, mid 70s, very tumultuous. Cultural changes in America, mass movements against the war, you know, the drug culture, other things, and flower power, and I could go on and on. And during that period of time, being in the military, we were somewhat isolated from what was going on in the country, and the war was unpopular. And it is true that when we came back, they didn't spit upon me or anybody else, but there was no celebration upon landing, or there was no glory that you returned home from. So what was my experience upon getting out of the military? It was kind of a lonely feeling, because when you're there, you're in control and you have a lot of responsibility, a lot of authority, you have a paycheck. The next day you have no responsibility, no authority, and no paycheck. So it's a little bit of a cultural shock, but you know, that's life. Yeah, I'll make it real quick, but it was in 1970, and India and Pakistan were having a war, and in the Indian Ocean, that's where the carriers are, and the Russians were sending submarines down through the Straits of Malacca there, between Malaysia and Sumatra. It's a narrow strait, and the Russian submarines would always go through surface. So we were down there, dropped our sonobuoys across the strait to catch the Russian submarines as they go through. And on Christmas Eve, I was there. It was my plane. We dropped our sonobuoys. We shut down one engine, and we just sit there and drilled holes in the sky and listened. And finally, we heard this Russian submarine going through on the sonobuoys. And then he talked to us. He said, American P3, he said, "Merry Christmas." You know, we weren't supposed to talk to anybody. We were MCON, mission control, lights off, everything off. We wanted to talk back to him, but we didn't. He asked again, says, "Last time, I know you're up there." He said, "Merry Christmas." Whoever the guy was had a good English. And then that was, and I didn't talk to him. That was the end of the conversation. So when we went back to our debriefing center, and this is what's fascinating, we have a device in the plane that takes the acoustic signal from the sonobuoys and analyzes it and tells you what the ship is that went through. It's complicated, and a lot of it's classified. It's very, very detailed and very good. And you can see on this machine, if you read it properly, it'll tell you exactly what the sonobuoys are picking up. It can listen to whales or shrimp, ships, everything else. So we went back to the debrief facility. I'm almost done with this story. And you can see this line there, which is the Russian submarine coming through, okay? So I saw another line. And I asked the guy, I said, "What's that other line?" And he said, "What other line?" And I said, "That other line." And he ripped the sheet off and he shredded it. He said, "There's no other line." He said, "You guys are dismissed." What do you think that other line was?
I don't know.
It was a U.S. submarine underneath the Russian submarine that was following him through the straits. So we picked up the signature of the U.S. submarine under the Russian submarine, and the location of U.S. submarine is top secret, so they wouldn't even admit that it was there, but he was right under him, and the Russian probably didn't even know it. That's pretty interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
It was pretty good, because I left the Air Force, so they tried to talk me into staying and all, but I had worked out a deal with Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, to get a scholarship, a fellowship, and so I was able to leave the Air Force and load up all my stuff and go directly to Berkeley and get a house, and I was a weirdo because I had short hair, and Berkeley was just filled with long hairs, and they were constantly demonstrating in the streets, and then they would shoot off what am I trying to say? Not mace, but tear gas. They would shoot off, and the whole campus, you couldn't even walk. You had to close your windows because the tear gas would just fill the air, and it would blow in your windows, and boy, your eyes you'd start crying. It was awful. And I tried to stay away, but I could hear those guys. A lot of those names that you read about in some of the history books dealing with that time, I could hear those guys out the windows. I mean, they were over there in the square giving their crazy speeches, and they had a big reunion down in Southern California while I was there. 6 months or so after I left the Air Force, and they contacted me and said, "Hey, we're going to have a big get together. We want you to come down there because this is for you, and we're going to tell you we're glad to see you again, etc." So I went down there to this house. I knew the guy who was putting it on, and I asked him, did his wife have a good wig? And he said, yeah. And I said, her name was Bernie. And I said, Bernie, can I put that wig on and pretend like that's my hair? And also here in the kitchen, when these guys that I serve with come through that front door, they'll see me sitting in there, only my hair won't be the normal short hair. It'll be down to my shoulder. And she said, okay. So I sat in there, and the look on those people's faces, they came through and saw me sitting back there with that long hair. But I could see them whispering the husbands to the wives and the wives to the husbands. And then later they tried to tell me, oh no, we recognize that was a wig. But I think that they really truly fell for it. Anyway, I had a lot of fun just sort of reminiscing. But you can just imagine leaving the South with the Martin Luther King marches and all the rest, and the things that I told you, and going to Berkeley where they were fighting things like that.
Never has so much military, economic, and diplomatic power been used so ineffectively as in Vietnam. If after all of this time and all of this sacrifice and all of this support, there is still no end in sight, then I say the time has come for the American people to turn to new leadership, not tied to the policies and mistakes of the past. I pledge to you, we shall have an honorable end to the war in Vietnam.